Look, Vincent, do you know the human chromosome 2 fusion thing?
No.
There's another like crazy successful prediction under evolution. Now, like it can be accommodated by separate creation, but it's like extremely ad hoc and crazy. So chimps have 48 chromosomes, humans have 46, so 23 pairs and 24 pairs for chimps, right? When we were able to karyotype, count the chromosomes on that like piece of paper, I'm sure you've seen it before. You're like, oh fuck, look,
No,
they
no.
have,
Sure. No, let me clarify. I have
yeah.
zero a lot of the scientific endeavors. I'm just trying to argue there's some kind of non sequitur here. So go ahead.
Oh, oh, I'm sorry, non sequitur. What do you mean?
My goal is just to point out the fact that, like, at some point, I think in this reasoning, I think there's just going to be like, we see similarity. Similarity implies common ancestry, and I think that's just ultimately going to be the
Well,
movement
I'm
regardless.
giving symmetry breakers where you can't just say, look, similarity is from a common creator.
Exactly.
That's why I'm not. Yeah, that's why I'm not saying, like, look, we share the same proteins between plants and stuff. That means we're related. No, that doesn't work.
Or bananas as the go-to.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I mean, a priori, that would be more evidence towards evolution because evolution had to be that way. It could have been anyway on theology, but theology can, or Christianity, creation, I'm sorry, could obviously accommodate it, right?
I
But
don't
like, I'm
think
just gonna like grant that.
you're going to grant what.
Grant common creator, common design. That the fact that we have the same like hemoglobin molecules as or proteins as like mice isn't evidence for common ancestry. I'll just grant that,
Oh, okay. So, but
even though I think it is. But yeah,
sure. But the point here is, so we have like this non-functional. I don't know if it was like 20,000 base pairs thing, and we're saying, well, because we find this in the great apes or whatever the correct taxonomical, whatever the phrase. Um,
well, I think
that,
only chimps and bonobos have it. I don't think gorillas have it. I have to look. Doesn't matter, but
okay, well, we find it the most similar of the apes,
yeah.
and then therefore we can infer the. This is where I think like maybe one of these inferences are coming in. Since there is just this really unique DNA code sequence, it'd be very implausible to think this could have happened in two different species that are so similar. You know, uh, so one
Exactly.
probably comes from some shared ancestor that became either both of them or something like that. Is that fair?
Yeah. So let me just make it a little bit more clear. So what would have to happen is that this exact mutation would have had to happen in the exact same spot between bonobos, chimps, and humans. And then not only that, but just by chance, right, the right organisms that had the mutation would have had to have sex with the right organisms that didn't. And then through genetic drift, right, it becomes fixed in the population.
Okay,
Like
just to be
it's like
clear,
pointing, it's like pulling out a single atom out of the entire known universe. Those kind of probabilities are happening there.
so just to be clear, like when we say there's genetic drift, my issue is like sometimes I just think built into like a lot of these concepts just are the theory itself. So like
No,
when I
no, no,
say
no. Genetic drift is observable. It's not. It's you can't
yeah,
deny that.
I I'm not. It's not that I'm denying like there
It's
is
just
some.
math.
Listen, lady, listen.
Listen, Linda.
It's not a matter of me denying it completely as a phenomenon. But like when I hear you say genetic drift, I think the way we're explaining these two different species. So like, okay, the reason why we had a common ancestor and they split off into two other thingies is because of genetic drift, and that's why we see these
Oh no,
ones.
no, 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 no. Genetic drift isn't a mechanism for speciation, actually, right? Evolution doesn't work when genetic drift is important, right? Because that's when populations are low. But evolution works when there's big populations for reasons that are like well beyond like this discussion. Um, there can't adaptive like traits can't be selected for with tiny populations. Genetic drift is just the random inheritance of like nearly neutral or nearly like mildly harmful mutations. And it's all random.
So, okay, in virtue of what, Tupac, if you had to summarize, sorry, I'm also eating nachos. If you had to summarize, in virtue of what is it very unlikely that it is not common design
Yeah,
in virtue of
yeah.
what? In
It
virtue of
would,
what specific symmetry breaker?
in virtue of the fact that like it would be extremely unlikely. It'd be so unlikely that we might as well just assume that we're brothers, right? That we would share, let's say, like 100 base pair deletion, right, at the exact same point on chromosome 2, right, between each other. That's how rare that would be, just because of the stochastic nature of mutations, which is observable, right? What we see is that it's that happening hundreds of thousands of times over and over again between chimps and humans, and it nests out in that perfect hierarchical fashion that would be expected under common ancestry.
And what is a suite? I'm sorry, like I'm complete layperson.
A
What is a
suite, just
suite?
like a set, right?
A set. Oh yeah, suite. Nested hierarchy and suites. Okay, yeah, okay.
It's just groups
I'm
within groups.
I'm trying to track along so I can wreck Vincent later or the next week. Okay, go ahead, go ahead.
I mean, that's it. I mean, like, look, and then I can give you specific examples. And human chromosome 2 is kind of like that. It's a little bit different, but it's like way more intuitive and easy to understand, which is why I like to talk about it.
All right.
I just
So,
want to
like,
know.
sorry.
I just want to note that Dutch David will never wreck me because he has still never dealt with my death argument, and he's afraid of me, which is fair. It's powerful.
That is an in-house
But
Christian discussion, which is not relevant to how likely evolution is, or like, oh sorry, um, if common design is more likely the case based on the observed natural facts than common ancestry, because that is the point at issue at this point. And clearly, Tupac thinks he has a symmetry breaker, making it very, very, very unlikely that common ancestry is the case, given the data we have and the things that we can observe.
yeah, I think it's. Let me try to because the thing is, I will. Tupac already knows I'm a layman and a non-caring one that much on this issue. I just wanted to spitball some ideas because it's really hard because I still think I'm just trying to see if like I can uncover like some kind of issue of reasoning here. So
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, whatever.
um, the so we get a bunch of base pairs or whatever you want to call them, the gene sequences, and they're like okay, they're all lined up. Well, it's very astronomical given some kind of some combinatorial issue that you would end up with species in these same groups of things reproducing to have them, and so and there's an appeal to genetic drift to kind of explain something. I forgot what that was, but
Well,
it
that's
was
just an extra layer of improbability because not only do the mutations have to happen in an individual at the same spot, which is like crazy, those individuals have to have sex with the right people such that that mutation persists with the population and we can discover it later on through genetics sequencing, like genome sequencing. Right. So it's not just enough that you and I get a mutation, the same mutation, which is crazy, like super crazy odds. We have to have sex with the right people that just by chance, this mutation that we originate, the founders of it, persists such that everybody else in the entire population eventually gets it over hundreds of years.
okay, but that don't take me wrong. With maybe I just don't see why that's crazy. Uh, Let me give you an example. Like take for example like a Genghis Khan figure. I'm sure a lot of people had a lot of similar genes to him, and onward and so forth.
Yeah.
That to me like that's I,
Well, obviously we
maybe
share
that's
genes with other people. It's just they're not going to be the right ones, such that there can be like a probabilistic inference made, right?
yeah. Well, the point is like let's isolate it to this like sequence. Maybe what you're trying to say is it's so large, the amount of. The thing is, I don't have a sense of largeness or
Well, it
smallness.
is. So
I don't know.
so it's 1/n, where n is the size of the population. That's the chance of any one mutation, nearly neutral mutation, becomes fixed, which is like incredibly low odds. And that's just the mutation becoming fixed, not the mutation occurring itself,
To be
right?
fair, like my idea proposed initially was not. I obviously don't think there's a common ancestor to explain why both these things. My idea was like just built into these creatures' genomes. Just so happens that God would have just put these like sequences there.
Super quick, guys. How does it become? I'm trying to track. How does it becomes fixed, Tupac? How does that
It's just
happen?
like look, we have this like one mutation like called A or whatever, right? There's
Right,
a
right.
chance that it'll get passed on to your kids, right?
Hmm.
Like whether or not the right sister chromosome chromatid gets passed over, right? It may just phase out of existence because like the wrong sperm, the wrong gamete,
Right,
right, doesn't contribute the
right.
right chromatid, right? That has to happen over and over and over again, such that just by chance everybody shares that one um, mutation, nearly mutual mutation,
Okay.
right? And if it becomes fixed, right, that's just what is counted by genetic drift.
So, just to be clear, every human shares this like 20,000 gene sequence, right?
Yeah, it's
Okay, and
75,000.
everyone.
Yeah,
You said
doesn't matter.
55,000.
75. It doesn't matter. Whatever.
75.
It's big.
Okay, let me even 100,000 gene
Yep.
sequence. Okay, so there's 100,000 gene sequences that, like, between these groups of creatures, they all share at the same place in the genetic code.
Yep.
Okay, my question is, like, we don't actually have like the original DNA of any of these creatures, or even, let's say, the common ancestor we're trying to base them off of, right?
Nope. Do not.
Okay. One of my problems is, like, without not having the original, how do you know that that mutation is a mutation in the first place? That's kind of was my initial question.
Yeah.
And
By
it
the way,
seems
it
like you
looks.
appealed. Okay, but
Yeah. So
are
like, so for,
they,
for for example, you can know that this is not functional, right? Because what only thing it does, right? It doesn't make a protein, right? All the thing it does is it allows for a fusion to happen, such that this thing called the Philadelphia chromosome appears, right? It exists in the individual, not in the population. And when you have the Philadelphia chromosome, your chances of getting CML, which is a type of leukemia, gets very high, right? That's how we
okay?
know it's
Yeah,
not functional.
it's a thing that combines with another thing, and once it does that, it increases your chance of leukemia. Okay,
Yeah, it might be
we
like
get that,
you definitely
but
get
don't
it. I
get me
forget.
wrong.
Mhm.
Don't get me wrong. Like, uh, I'm no genetic code looker. Uh, so when you go to do that, when you're looking at a DNA sequence, is there ever cases where it looks like a mutation but isn't?
Well, I mean, that's possible. It's just extremely unlikely, given that we can do sequencing. We can see what it does under all kinds of different conditions. We can see if it's translated, which is transcribed, which is DNA to RNA. We can see if it's translated. We can see if it's under selection, right, by looking at big populations. I mean, there's a lot of ways to know whether or not it's functional or not functional. And to know if it's a mutation, right, you're just going to look at like what is perceived to be the next common
Oh,
like related
just to
species and then see if it's there.
just to clarify, I'm not
Mhm.
debating whether it's non-functional. By the way, like, I
Okay.
accept, like I said, I take your testimony as it's non-functional, right?
Yeah.
But in my mind, it's like, to me, like, it's just a briefcase of just letters and codes, and, like, yeah, there may be non-functional stuff in your briefcase, but that could just been carried along and originally packed in too,
Maybe,
right? Like,
maybe I shouldn't say this because I can't remember how to pull the paper. Actually, I have it in a Discord where I keep track of this stuff. I think it's an example of non-homologous end joining. And non-homologous end joining has these telltale signs that are only observed in non-homologous end joining. And I think that may be a case of it, or it's a duplicon. I forget. But like that's another way. You can just look at the way that the mutation is, right? And if it shares those telltale features that we know are mutations by observing like actual organisms in real time, then we can be sure that it's a mutation. Now, is it logically possible that God just made this non-functional thing to look like a mutation? Sure, right? But is that reasonable to believe?
Why not?
Why
Oh,
not?
come on.
I mean, you can believe whatever you want. It's just, what theory is more reasonable, right?
What's the criterion for a more reasonable theory?
Well, I mean, so if we take something that occurs in real time, right, we see that it has these features, then we observe these features, right, in our genomes, then you're going to have at least some good, and you see that these features like confer the same non-function that these mutations happen that we observe in real time, uh, don't have, then you can have like a really strong reason to believe that they're mutations themselves. I mean, you can deny that, but what else am I supposed to say?
I'm afraid they're gonna do precept right away.
Look, let me talk about human chromosome 2 fusion because that's like a lot easier to understand. It's less kind of gibberish laden. So, like the way the story goes, right? early on we found the karyotypes. We found that that chimps have 48 chromosomes, we have 46. We have 23 pairs, they have 24 pairs. And that was a big problem because we're supposed to be closely related to chimps. And if they have an extra set of chromosomes, right, we need a reason for that. And the only reason that could account for it is a fusion. So it was predicted that there was a fusion. Later on in like the early 80s or the mid 80s or something, they were able to do this banding pattern technique where they lined up all the chromosomes and they found that the banding patterns matched such that two of the chromosomes on the chimp karyotype, right, match our human chromosome 2 as if they were like stuck together end to end, right? And then in the early 2000s, we are able to sequence the entire genomes of chimps and humans. And what we found, right, is that in the middle of these two end-to-end linkage, right, is a 800 base pair region to telomere region, right? And I think it's ATC, I forget what it is, but like this is 5 base pair repeat. And the only place we see these things at this density, right, are at telomeres, which are on the ends of chromosomes. Right now, this is something like you could just say, like it just happened to be that way under, young Earth creationism or something like that. Fine, right? But this is a really, really risky prediction, right? That the evolutionists had to make before they knew nothing about what the DNA looked like, and it turned out to be correct.
Super quick, and if you're annoyed by these clarification questions, let me know and I'll shut up. But what is fused, and what do you mean by
Yeah,
fusion
so there's
there?
a T to T or a telomere to telomere fusion. So at the ends of all the chromosomes, there's these things called telomeres, which kind of protect your DNA, and you have a telomerase that like kind of replicates them so that they don't get whittled down and start to like mess with your functional your genes that are kind of like further into the chromosome, right? And what we see there, right, is exactly what would be expected if the T to T fusion occurred sometime in the past after chimps and humans diverged from the common ancestor. No, it's not logically impossible. It's not like a true deductive symmetry breaker like the other arguments I was giving against creationism, right, where there are separate kinds, right? But it just goes to show like how incredibly predictive evolution is and how crazy it would be that this is a coincidence.
Right. That's why, even as a layperson, I found the whole Tiktaalik example just so convincing.
Yeah, that's kind of like, I don't like the fossil stuff. I think it's way weaker, but that's kind of similar. A huge prediction that was successful.
Tupac, what field are you in?
Well, I'm a medical doctor, but I have a degree in biochemistry. I've never really studied evolution at like a high level. I'm just interested in that.
What practice are you in?
ER.
Hmm.
But there's a book by this guy called Graham Finley. He's a Christian, and he goes over like the exact same inferences that I'm giving. I took a couple of his examples actually.
What is the book's name? I'll write it down. What is the book?
I think it's called Human Evolution, but look up Graham Finley.
I had a phone
Yeah.
call. I missed everything over the last few minutes. What happened?
Oh, shut up, Vincent. What is his name? Finley? How do you spell that?
I don't know. Let me see. It's kind of spelled weird,
Um,
honestly. I think Graham spelled weird.
I can spell it for you. Gay. Just look it up.
Yo, Tupac, like, isn't there, like, couldn't genetics have theoretically disproven our sense of evolution
Oh yeah.
before we knew about genetics? Like, and the fact that it wholly supports, like, what we understand from the physiology and the fossil record and a whole bunch of other things, right? Is an example of mutually exclusive lines of inquiry converging, right, on an answer, right, and buttressing each other by doing so.
Oh my God, yeah. The fossil record, comparative anatomy, and genetics, they all converge on the same phylogenies, the exact same ones. It's crazy. It would be
It's
so
all nat-
crazy that this view was false.
I think that's
It's all
the
naturalistically.
easiest.
That's why you're shocked, dude. At the end on the last day when you're all standing before Christ and he's judging people, all the evolutionists are being shoved into hell.
Look, this isn't like against
It's gonna be
Christianity.
crazy. What'd you say, Tupac?
It's not. This is like this isn't against Christianity at all.
Of course it is, my little
This is a
Scotty.
slippery slope.
That's like
Don't get in the. That wasn't my argument. I was just trying to play the game. So,
that's like one of the easiest lines of evidence to criticize, right? Is the fossil record. It's just entirely a farce.
Why do you say that?
well, before you move on to that, what was the conclusion on the genetic thing? If no one minds me asking, then you can go right to that.
Wait, what about the genetic thing? I mean, I can just give you other examples, like ERVs or ERVs is another one that people like to use. It's similar to the one I gave.
No,
Pseudogenes.
I was hoping like maybe Jimmy would have a principled objection, and then you would have like some comment on it. That's what I hope would happen.
I mean, you could just say that we're all wrong. We're like just like monkeys, like not understanding what DNA looks
No,
like.
no,
Right?
dude. That's not what we're doing. Don't do that.
I mean, that's the only thing I could think we could say. Or God is testing us. That's another.
No, well,
That's another thing you could say.
the problem is okay. The problem is like you're begging the question. Right? So the issue is there needs to be provided an independent criterion by which you could adjudicate what predictions are like risky and what theory is more reasonable and things like that. And it just seems like people who believe the theory in question don't really have any access to that, which undermines the entire claim.
You don't think that the prediction of a fusion event is not risky? You don't think that's risky?
I have no
Before
idea.
we can look at the DNA?
You'd have to provide the criterion by which to adjudicate that it is.
Look, it just seems okay. So we know that fusion events are rare, right? They can happen in individuals. Sometimes they're lethal, but we know that they're not all lethal, right? That's just observed. Like, do you accept that?
I don't know. I don't know, right? It's like if I
Okay, then I don't know how I'm supposed to talk to you. Like,
well, yeah, I mean, like, so look, suppose I want to suppose that I want to prove to someone that George Washington was a historical figure or something. And let's say that like I'm an expert in history. I've read like a bunch of documents written by Lincoln. I've read a bunch of documents like corresponding with him. I've read people who've written about Lincoln. I look at like archaeological blah 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 blah. And let's say that like I'm talking with a random person on the street, and I'm like, hey, there's this document XB over in Europe of like someone sending letters to Lincoln. Isn't that really good evidence? And the layman's like, oh, I guess like if it exists, maybe it is. But since he doesn't have any background knowledge that's related to that, like, what is he supposed to say? Right? Like the only good arguments for a view are going to be arguments that have some connection with the audience's
yeah,
background beliefs. And so, I mean, you're right, right? Like if you give me a super sophisticated biological argument, most of the people in this room, I think, are already at like an incredible
sure.
disadvantage to even decide whether it's good evidence or not. They just have to remain
Well,
silent.
here's an invitation to look into it. Ken Miller has a very like introductory, like layperson kind of way of explaining these things. He talks about like the NANOG pseudogene and also human chromosome 2 fusion. I think you guys should read that.
Ken
But
Miller from
like,
the Dover trial?
yeah, that guy. He has like a really nice book. It's easy to read.
I don't. So I think this topic is of some significance, but I just, given that like I have a bunch of other things that I have to do in my life, and those things involve studying and so forth and buying books, it just seems like the investment reward
Sure.
calculus is too low. But I mean, it just seems like there are lots of claims on the part of I don't know what you want to call it, right? Like the family of
It's
evolutionary
common ancestry.
models. Yeah, that's a great term. All right, let's use that, right? So the common ancestry claim, right, is associated with like a bunch of lines of evidence, and they're just like notoriously farcical. They're just horrible arguments. Most of them
Well, how
beg
do you
the
know? You just said you
question,
didn't have the
or
background knowledge to understand it. Like, how do you know? Right.
well, I think what you're bringing up about fusions is like I mean, I don't know what that is, but I'm assuming like this is a genetic argument.
Yeah. Look,
Like it has to do with some kind
fusions are
of
extremely rare, right? However, we have one exactly where it needs to be in the human genome to explain evolution, so evolution doesn't get falsified. That, in a nutshell, is the inference.
yeah.
Isn't it to explain? Isn't it to explain specifically to explain the difference between humans and our closest non-ape or closest ape ancestor.
Yeah, the
It's
difference in
something like
number of
that, right?
chromosomes. Yeah, they have 48, we have 46. The only thing that would
Ex-
explain that is if we had a fusion, because there was definitely not enough time to grow new
and when we looked
or
into
lose
our
a chromosome.
chromosomes, we found that we in fact had a chromosome that had telomeres in the middle, right?
Yeah, for a T to T fusion, which is
Which is
exactly what would have been needed.
what we would expect. Yeah.
Yeah, so if it's a genetic argument, the problem is just going to be that like there's no natural phenomena to explain the causes, right? And most common ancestry proponents believe in things like, say, natural selection, which are just like incoherent.
But do you think that mutations don't happen? We observe mutations happening in real time. We could do like fish analyses where we radio label parts of genomes and watch the mutations happen,
Okay.
right? Where we can actually see them on a karyotype with our eyeballs.
Yeah, but what
What do you mean?
causes them? What causes them to happen
Well, it
in
depends.
any kind of
There's
like?
a bunch of different types of mutations, and there's different mechanisms. For example, non-homologous end joining happens when there's this repair mechanism, right? Fixes double strand breaks in the DNA, and there's like a telltale sign that it occurred. And we know exactly how it happens from like doing the modeling of the enzymes involved, right?
No, sure, like we could grant all that, right? But my point is, there's going to be a lot of different causes for any given biological state of an object that
Yeah.
we're observing. So, like, if I have a weird mark on my skin, for example, the explanation for it might not necessarily be my genetics. It might be that like I got cut
But what else besides
in a road
genetics would
accident or
explain
something.
differences in genomes?
Why would only genetics explain differences in genes?
Because what genetics is pertains to is genomes. Right? Like I don't understand. Like, look, there's a bunch of different ways you can get mutations. You can get them from the sun, like in thymine dimers. You get these duplication errors from DNA replication. You get the non-homologous end joining. You get these random duplicon events, right? You can get ERVs or retroviruses insert themselves. You get like recombination, which is a natural event for diversity. Like, what do you mean, man? Like, there's a bunch of different types, and they're all like observed and well documented.
I'm not challenging that, right? My point is we don't have like some kind of closed causal story as to how the various things genetically that going back to like whatever the fusion prediction is supposed to be, right? We don't have a closed causal story, and we don't have a mechanism that's natural that would produce the results that we're talking about.
What do you mean by a closed causal story? We know the mechanism for T to T fusions. We've observed that in the lab. We've caused it to happen in Salmonella, where we stacked like 9 T to T fusions and they were reproductive. Some of them actually reproduce better than the wild type. Some are worse. So we know it happens and we know how it happens, right?
Yeah, so like from a bird's eye perspective, the trouble that these predictions are going to face is that insofar as some kind of story is given to explain the effect, and so make the prediction, it's not going to be anything that like a non-common ancestry proponent wouldn't predict. They can just build a similar explanatory story.
Okay, I mean, so what's the
There's going to be a
story?
question
What's the
about,
alternative story?
oh, I don't know.
You can always ad hoc, right? But I'm just saying that when you look at the two stories and what would need to happen to explain it under, separate creation, it just seems obvious that it's going to be ad hoc and unlikely, right?
Why
Evolution is
is
the one that made the risky prediction.
Yeah, so that's what I'm pointing out, right? Is that like the only way this prediction is going to be differentiated from its alternatives is to say, well, mine is more likely slash less ad hoc. But my question is like, okay, by what criterion is it more likely and less
Well,
ad
I
hoc?
just think ad hoc is when you say, well, it happened because of this, and you have no independent reason to believe it. Look, I mean, don't you think that it's
That's
like
true of evolution,
crazy?
right? That's true of common ancestry.
Okay, so like, I mean, you can try to give some examples of ad hoc rescue devices, but I don't know if you're going to be able to find any. But like, can we just agree that if we know that T to T fusions are extremely rare, that the chances of us observing it when we needed to observe it to rescue the evolutionary theory is extremely unlikely?
I don't know. I
Well,
would have to.
extremely unlikely if it's false, I'm sorry.
No, I don't think that common ancestry is predictive. Right? I think that's like part of the problem.
But it is. I gave you a prediction. Look, all you have to do is agree with me that T to T fusions can happen, though they're very unexpected to like pick out a single organism and that would happen. Now, what would need to happen, right, is that happen, but just by chance, right? Because we needed it to use evolution to be explanatory for it to be explanatory. It would have had to happen by chance in a single organism, and that organism would have needed to have sex with the right people such that it got fixed within the population. And that would have been a huge coincidence, right?
You're asking me if I agreed with that. Would that be would something there be unlikely? That's the question.
It's
Like the
extremely
prediction.
unlikely. Like unless you want to say that God is making it happen just to like test us or something. You could always say that. I mean,
Yeah,
whatever.
but this is begging the question against my position, right? Like what the assumption there. It's sort of like when we talk about like the age of the Earth, and people
I'm
talk
not
about
making the question.
Starlight.
I'm just telling you, like, which theory do you think is more predictive? Which theory has more virtues? The one that makes this risky prediction, this extremely low likelihood event, which would need to happen for the theory to be true, did happen, or one which anything we find
Okay,
is consistent with
when we
the
say the
theory.
prediction is risky, right? I don't know what that's supposed. If we don't have a criterion by
Look,
which to
Look, it
differentiate
means that if we didn't
which
observe
theory
what we
is better,
observed, we'd have a really hard time explaining common ancestry. A really hard time. That's why it's risky.
if we didn't observe that, we'd have a hard time explaining common ancestry.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's any independent reason to believe that's a thing in the first place, right?
Wait, what's the thing in the first place?
Common ancestry. It's
Well,
like
I
it's
mean,
like
okay.
look, dude. If I predict the light coming on, then the magical ghost in the walls theory is supported because I predicted it on that theory. And it's like, okay, well, I don't believe that that's a explanatory mechanism in the first place. So why would I think that that really
Well, that
matters?
just
That
begs the
you're
question against my view. We're doing a comparison of how this genetics can be accounted for. So the neutral stuff is how mutations happen. We know mutations are rare. We know we can do DNA testing to determine paternity and solve crimes. That's all
wait.
neutral, right?
What did you think was the question, Biggie?
Well, when you say, look, I don't think that common ancestry, that's like not a part of the commitments that I hold to, right? But that's just what's under dispute. So like when you say, well, I'm going to deny it because I don't already have a commitment to common ancestry, that seems just to beg the question against
No,
the
no,
argument
no,
you're
no, no,
making.
no, no. That's the. I think you're misunderstanding me, right?
Okay.
The point is, if the problem is that your argument is contingent on already believing some of the distinctive claims of
Oh, I
common
see.
ancestry,
Like
right?
what?
I don't share those.
What presuppositions am I bringing to the table here?
Well, that like common ancestry is a
Nope. I'm not assuming that.
reasonable postulate or something like that.
Oh, so okay, so me thinking that common ancestry is possible or reasonable to believe in light of good evidence is like bringing things to the table. What do you mean by that? Like, am I supposed to like just think common ancestry is impossible or like ridiculous from the get-go?
I think that I mean, what constitutes science is its own like debate to be had, right? But like
I'm not talking about
I
what
would
science. I'm
think
just
that
asking what's
most.
reasonable to believe. I don't think like science is some like specific endeavor that's like bracketed off from history or testimony or regular inferences of everyday inferences.
Okay, so yeah, so then going back, right? The problem is like, hey, if I already believed some of the distinctive claims of common ancestry, right? That like it's a good explanation or something like that.
But you don't. But look,
And
the
even
inference I
better, if I
gave,
had
you don't have to believe that.
hold on, dude. Hold on. Gotta let me land, bro. All right. So if I already, whether you're giving me good reasons is the very thing in dispute, right? So it's not going to help your case to just say that you're giving me good reasons. So the issue is if I already believed that common ancestry is like a decent competitor, a good candidate out there to explain what's going on, right? And then it makes a prediction that's unique to it,
Uh,
that would be interesting. But the problem is, I don't actually think common ancestry is a
gotcha.
serious competitor. And I
So
also
what you're saying is that your
don't.
priors are so low on common ancestry that like this prediction, successful prediction, doesn't move the needle enough such that you would say it's reasonable to believe. Is that it?
That's 100% right. Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's fine. But like, what reason other than your interpretation of Holy Scripture do you have to think that your priors for common ancestry should be low?
There's no reason to believe it.
What do you
Like it's
mean?
just it's just
But I'm offering reasons to believe, and you want to go to like the conceptual stuff.
okay. I'm I'm not sure where I feel like I lost you, right? Because the contention that I was
Look,
making
what justifies your low
was
priors in common
that
ancestry? That's the question. Another way put another way.
yeah, and that's fine. That's perfectly putting it in that Bayesian formula is fine, right? But that's just to say, like the argument you're giving is contingent on having higher priors, right? So when you say I've given you evidence, that's just making the question against the fact that we pointed
No,
out, right? That
no,
I have
it's not.
low priors.
It can't be begging the question against whether or not. But it doesn't beg the question. Maybe it would beg the question that like you should believe it because of this evidence because your priors are so low for common ancestry. But it doesn't beg the question whether or not it's evidence. It's obviously evidence, right? And obviously it's a symmetry breaker, right?
So in order for it to constitute evidence, we would need independent evidence that raises the priors. So that's my
Yeah,
question, right?
yeah.
Like, okay, what's the
The fusion
independent
event,
evidence?
right? The fusion event occurring, right? Way, 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 way less likely if common ancestry is true. So, what is it? H on E, right? With the evidence being the fusion. Um, no, E on. I guess it would be E on H. Actually, I won't even try that because I don't know the math well. But what I'm trying to say here is that like the fusion occurring by itself just by chance and common ancestry being false, it's way, way, way less likely than it being true on common ancestry, right? Because it's
Why?
necessitated by common ancestry.
Oh, I don't see why that's true. But like, let's just grant that it is, right? I could just say that like the design plan necessitates it. Why is that going to make any
Okay,
difference?
well then we could compare your mechanisms for that, right? Like, oh, fine, you could say that, but how is that reasonable?
I don't understand the question.
Why did
What?
God put a fusion site where it would make common ancestry look true?
Well, okay, let me take a step back because maybe I misunderstood you. I thought that I was starting with the assumption, and I apologize if I misunderstood you, but I was starting with the assumption that we were talking about like a theistic evolutionary point of view versus like a young Earth creationism
Yeah,
or
exactly. Yeah.
some. Okay, well then our mechanisms are going to be the same, right? We're both going to have a creator back of everything that explains why the things are the way they are. So I don't know why. Like
But that's just a blanket.
you'd have to tell me what the difference.
But we're digging
Go
deep.
ahead.
We're
Go
digging
ahead.
deeper, right? I want to say that under theism, right, evolution occurred. Maybe it's like natural. He just like set things into motion, like a clock, or maybe he's like this, where he like makes each mutation happen the way he wants it to happen. Who cares, right? But then, like when we dig deeper into our theories, right, presumably you're going to have a reason why this fusion site exists there, other than God wanted it that way. Well, I have a theory here that explains all the data, right, which is common ancestry, right, and it's consistent with God wanting it that way. But it's not just to say that God wanted it that way. I have independent reasons to think God wanted it that way.
Okay, so imagine that I apologize because you don't have like I can't like come on camera or anything, but like imagine in your mind's eye that I've got like I don't know what's it called, like a diagram or something, right? And on one side of the diagram, I like draw a really childish picture of my point of view, right? And there's like I don't know, like a circle that's God, and then there's like an arrow coming down, and it says like the fusion event or something, right? So what's predicted here is that any of the given, any amount of the given biological data is going to be finally explained by, well, because God wants it that way, right? And then correct me where I'm wrong, but what I'm understanding in your view is that you're adding to the picture sort of a middleman. You're saying the arrow goes down from the God circle, hits common ancestry, and then there's another arrow to the fusion thing, right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So then my issue is just like, I've got a straight arrow, you've got a middleman. Why believe there's a
Wait,
middleman?
because presumably there's a reason why God made it that way, right? You can't just say God. And there's no like that's consistent with everything. I have like by itself, right? That's consistent with what God wants, and it's predictive.
But what I'm saying is like that's always going to be more things to explain on your side, right?
Wait,
If I give a reason
dude,
why,
come on, dude. God presumably has a reason why you wanted a fusion there on your view, right?
yeah. So
I have an explanation.
whatever
You
reason
don't.
I give, the reason why God wanted it there was for common
Yeah,
ancestry?
because God created through common ancestry.
No. That's a instrumental
Yeah. So
cause, but that's not
what's
a
your instrumental
motivation.
cause? And what's your motivation? So he wants common ancestry, and
Oh,
the mechanism is, evolution.
I don't
Yeah, I
know.
know. That's
I'm
my
not,
point, is that you don't
I
have a
don't have.
theory, right? So why should we take your view, which is just based on your presuppositions about biblical interpretation, over mine, right? That has, predictive power, right? And is very risky and explains.
I don't understand what we've gained that way, right? So like, imagine that you have a competitor that says, Jimmy the magic. There's an angel called Jimmy, and he makes everything happen in genetics the way we see it come about, right? And that's what's replacing common ancestry in your model. Literally, all of the data that you have to predict, Jimmy the magic angel makes all of that come about. Now, why is your theory better than that one?
Because mine makes predictions, and risky ones that could have been easily falsified, right? Or just confirmed, rather. That's why.
Jimmy the angel is going to make the same predictions.
Okay, but you did. No, there wasn't a prediction, right? Because you didn't make that prediction. You're just saying post hoc or ad hoc, right? Well, Jimmy wanted it that way. We discovered it because we looked at the genomes and found the fusion site. That's different than me saying, look, for my theory to be true, this needs to happen. And look, 100 or 50 years later, we find that it happened. Like, what do you
Yeah,
mean?
I'm not sure what the difference is supposed to be, right? So in both theories, maybe what you're saying is like in history,
Mhm.
right? So maybe biologists, I don't know how many years ago, were motivated by their belief in common ancestry, associated with all of the biological data that they used to argue that this prediction was going to be found, right? Maybe that's what motivated them historically, but it's not hard to imagine that they would be motivated to think the same thing if they thought an angel had put the stuff there, right?
No,
It's not
no, they
really
would
going to
have no
matter
reason to
them.
believe the fusion site if they thought an angel, because the angel is consistent with anything that they would have found, right? Fusion site or not.
Why
Don't you
would the
see?
angel be consistent with anything that they found?
Look, because not having a fusion site and having a fusion site doesn't do any violence to the theory that the angel made the genetics the way they are. It explains everything, so it's a bad theory, right? Or it's consistent with all observations. That makes it a bad theory.
I don't see how it's going to be since it's tied to the specific causal associations that we think are explained by uh, common ancestry, right? So let me explain that real quick, right? So suppose that I've got some observation A,
Uh-huh.
and I think that that causes or predicts or explains whatever some observation B. Okay. And then what's explaining the causal link between those two things or that prediction is some overarching theory. And in one case, it's common ancestry, right? But the concrete observations that are associated with common ancestry, without which it's nothing more than a story, right? Those same associations can just be made with the way we think an angel behaves,
Yeah,
right?
I agree that the angel accommodates all data, right? But
No, that's
one
not
theory
what I'm
makes
saying.
predictions.
No, that's not what I'm
Okay.
saying. Right? So what we would do is we would say A causes B, and common ancestry explains A causes B, right? And all I'm doing is saying A causes B, and the angel explains A causes B. And then you respond by saying, well, the angel would explain A does not cause B. And I'm saying, no, the angel is the explanation for A causes B. So anytime that A does not cause B, or something like that, right? That would just falsify the angel view because we're just
I'm
using the
confused.
observations.
Why don't we just talk about God? Because we're stipulating that God causes all these things, right? And then we're deciding which mechanism better predicts, better explains, is causing the data, right? And mine is common ancestry, and yours is separate creation, right? So like, stop talking about angels. Just talk about God, right? My theory makes predictions. It can be falsified. Your theory does actually make predictions and has been falsified, right?
Why
Or
is
just confirmed.
why is the angel theory that I'm putting forward falsified?
Well, but for the reasons I went over earlier, maybe you weren't here. There's a prediction that you guys are committed to on your theory of separate created kinds, right? If your theory is true, then you wouldn't expect us to share mutations, or at least a lot of them, with chimps, But we do observe that, and we observe it in a hierarchical necessary fashion, which is what is predicted under evolution, and it's the opposite is predicted under your view.
We believe the Bible is literally true.
I just don't understand that, right? Because like one thing that might be like a disadvantage here is like I'm not a young Earth creationist, so I don't actually believe
Well, you
any
deny
of
common
the.
ancestry, though, right? That's fine. I'll just say,
Yeah, right. So,
yeah,
but that might be. I don't know if that's like affecting the nature of the conversation, but like I don't think that
it does a little bit,
that
but not a
the.
lot.
Sorry.
It does a little bit. I mean, there's other problems with young Earth that older Earth fixes, but it doesn't fix all of them.
Okay. Well, the key
Yeah.
feature is that like I'm unaware of a belief that I have that entails really much about uh, the biological
Oh,
evidence
well, I'll
we're
tell
going
you.
to
So,
find down to the nitty gritty of.
yeah, I'll tell you. So, you believe that cats and dogs are separately created kinds. They never shared a common ancestor, right?
Probably.
But,
Sure.
well, you think that there are some like kinds, right, that never shared a common ancestor. Maybe not cats and dogs. Maybe like foxes and elephants, whatever.
Yeah, of course.
So,
Yeah.
so what you expect, right, is going to be different than what I would expect, right? Given that we know about like inheritance patterns and mutations, that's where the symmetry breaker is.
Okay, so that you're saying the expectations need to be different
Well, they just
in
happen to be
biology?
different, so that we can compare the views,
I
right?
don't
Based
understand.
if you accept what a mutation is and how they're inherited, yeah,
Okay, but why is that going? Well, I've observed. We can observe how they're inherited, right?
yeah, in real
Okay,
time.
but we haven't observed creation, right?
No, we can't observe creation. No.
Okay, well, I mean, maybe we are able to, but we cannot go back in time and observe it, right?
Yeah, yeah, no.
Okay, so the issue is like I don't know how we're going to draw predictions about creation, like what
Well,
we'd
because
expect
okay, look,
biologically.
because if it happened like you say it happens, then we expect A. If it happens how I say how it happened on my view, we expect B. We observe B. That's what I'm saying.
I don't know. I don't know how to reconstruct that. That avoids a question begging fallacy, right? So if
But
what you mean is there's a certain way that I mean, for just to summarize, right? There's a certain way that biology works, which is how we observe it. If we project the expectations based on how biology works on
uh
a unique, unrepeatable incident long ago in history, then we can make these and that predictions. But like,
well, here's the
why would we
assumptions, man.
think that that?
The assumptions here that you could say is begging the question is the only way you could say it's begging the question, but it's a crazy thing to deny, is how genes are passed on and mutations are passed on and what mutations are or how they occur. Those are the assumptions that I think are neutral. Nobody disagrees with.
Maybe in a
Well, how
world
do
that
you know that? The problem is like creation isn't a passing on of genes. So why would we use the expectations that we have for passing on of genes?
You don't think we passed on
For
genes when Adam and Eve had kids?
sure, but they didn't. They didn't receive their genes from earlier
Yeah,
creatures.
I know. I know. I'm assuming that on your view, and then we're seeing the entailments. We're seeing if it fits the data that we can observe today. And it doesn't. That's why it's just disconfirming.
What I'm at a loss. Like, what predictions do you think the view
No,
that
yeah,
Adam
I'll
and
tell you.
Eve?
So, like, look, Adam and Eve are separately created than dogs, right? If that's the case, then we expect dogs to have a completely separate, like unrelated, no patterns, similar patterns
Why?
between
Why
humans and
would we expect
dogs
that?
for mutations. Because that's how mutations work, and we observe that in real time. Now, that's what I'm saying. You could
we,
deny that, but like, good luck, man.
that's yeah. I just think that's silly, right? Like, why would I think that? Why would I think that the picture I have of mutations, which
Uh-huh.
presupposes these certain mechanisms for how genes are passed on, which is not the mechanism that's in play, presumably, if creation is done specially, at least.
But I'm confused. Do you
Um,
do you believe that passed on mutations in genes from Adam and Eve on?
I have no idea.
Was there
think
like did humans reproduce differently back then?
I don't think so.
Because it sounds like you were committing to. Okay, then like why wouldn't Adam pass on his genes to his progeny, right, and so on and so forth?
That's not the question, though. The question is, why would he not have exactly the overlap that we see? Like, suppose that I don't think we can, but like suppose we could go back in time by looking at various things
Yeah,
in the observable
the
world
monkey.
and build.
Sorry, the monkey
Okay.
sequence. Why couldn't Adam have the same thing? Why isn't? I see what you're saying. That's what I said earlier.
Yeah, it just
Are you asking me why in the beginning in creation monkeys and or chimps and humans have the same mutations?
yeah. Why not?
Is that it? Well, because we know what the mutations are. Here's like a commonly used, it's kind of overused inference, like ERVs, right? ERVs are genetic scars from insertions from retroviruses. We know this happens. We observe it. HIV is one of them, right? They jump in our genomes, land in our genomes in a probabilistic way by way of an enzyme called integrase, which is coded by the virus, right? We know that's probabilistic. You can't predict it, right? It's just like pretty much random, just based on like what's going on in the cell at the time, right? We have like 100,000 of these, right? And they match up perfectly with chimps, and they match up really well with other apes, and then less so with mammals, and so on and so forth, right?
Well,
You're going to need to say that like for some reason these viruses all inserted in the same place between like humans and chimps, even though we don't observe that in real time.
I don't know why we would need to say that, right? Like we're just gonna for any given biological datum, the young Earth creationist is just going to say that what explains that involves factors that we're not aware of yet,
No, you can ad
plus
hoc, right?
factors.
You don't have an explanation. That's fine.
Well, whoa, hold on a second. Not having an explanation for the data is not the same thing as being ad hoc.
Well, it is when you have to make up an explanation that could accommodate the data, but you have no independent reason to believe it. That's what ad hoc is, right?
But that's what
So you're going to
prominence
need to
is.
give a reason why these viruses landed in the same spots between humans and chimps, even though they don't happen. Like if you get HIV and I get HIV, we'll have a different insertion point.
Okay, there's like a couple of problems there. One is that like young Earth creationists do, on their view, have an independent reason. But the second problem is like I don't see how your standard of ad hoc wouldn't just refute common ancestry the same way. It just seems like
Wait,
all of
what's
this
my ad hoc?
conversation, real quick, all of this conversation, it seems to me like comes down to an underdetermination problem, right? That like
No, 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 no,
there's
dude. I
data.
gave you a way that you symmetry break between the underdetermination, which is the predictions of where mutations occur, right? I have a perfect model, right, that explains how these mutations got the pattern they do, which is based on things that we observe in real time. You don't have such a model. This is like flat Earth. Like I
I
know
don't
why the sun
personally.
rises the way it does, and why like these parts of the globe are lighted at this part in time of day, and like the flat earthers say, well, a model isn't. That's just your model. It doesn't mean it's true. Okay, sure, I could be wrong.
Well, that's not the issue, right? The issue is that like the explanatory postulates in the model,
Mhm.
right, can be replaced at no cost.
I'm confused what you mean by that.
If you tell a story about why things happen the way they do, such that the datum that we predict occurs in history, right? It becomes something that we can observe. Somebody else can tell almost the same story, replace some of the explanatory items, and nothing happens, right? There's no reason to prefer one story over the other.
Yeah, that's just Stafford's underdetermination problem, or a problem of alternatives, right? That only makes sense when you don't have experiments that can be done to differentiate the theories, such that it's not underdetermined anymore. And I gave one.
Brother,
Yeah.
again, so the problem the problem is that like the alternative theories are going to be supported just as easily by the experiments
But
because
they can't, because you have commitments to what needs to be observed, what should be observed if your theory is true, whether or not you realize it or not.
this okay, again, there's two things here, right? So like on the one hand, like I myself, just to be, and I'm just saying this like to be honest with you, just so we're on the same page, right? I myself like don't really have any kind of scientific point of view about what explains how we got where we are today, right? I'm a skeptic on that topic. But as far as like people who put forward theories, it's just false to say that they're going to have some commitments that are going to be competing with common ancestry. I don't think so because I think common ancestry is entirely ad hoc, right? It's just a made up
Wait,
story.
why?
It's
How is
just
it ad hoc? Why, how is it ad hoc, man? You said this like 3 times. But where's the ad hoc nature of common ancestry?
again because the story that constitutes it can have its items replaced at no cost. We can tell the same,
That's not.
almost the same story. We can just replace the idea of like things sharing one common ancestor with like a common designer
No, you
or an
can't.
angel and spinning stuff here,
No, you
whatever.
can't. Look, unless you want to deny mutations and how reproduction happens and all that, you can't. I already showed you how there's a symmetry breaker here. And what I mean by ad hoc is when you find something that's disconfirming of your theory, something that your theory needs to be true or predicts, and then finds out to be false. And then you say, well, that's because of this other thing that you have no independent reason to believe. That's what I think ad hoc to be. But I haven't heard any
I
reasons to
think,
think my view is ad hoc. All you said is that other theories can explain it, and I'm showing you that that's not the case, at least in this instance.
okay, well, I'll just say this. I think we can move on because I don't think I can persuade you. But the reason you heard to believe that it's ad hoc is what I just explained, that the same story can be duplicated,
That's not ad hoc.
just the key elements switched. So
That's not ad
that's
hoc.
the reason to think that it's ad hoc.
No,
And
that's
then
just
as far
alternative
as
explanations.
hold on. As far as your, I mean, yeah, that's what a good explanation for what ad hoc is.
That's
But
not what ad hoc is. Yeah.
as far as your claims about the different expectations that would be falsified, when we went to investigate your claim that we would have those expectations, you couldn't actually show that we need them. You were just starting with an assumption that we would expect these different things given how we observe adaptation working right now. Well, why would I assume that? Why,
Wait, what
why
am I
should I
assuming?
assume
I'm sorry.
anything? Right? Like, why are we approaching science with assumptions?
Wait, what am I assuming?
You're assuming that the explanation as to why we see certain similarities and differences, as to
No, I'm
what we can
not.
observe in
That's being
genes today.
tested. It's being tested. It's not being assumed.
You're, I don't think you're listening, because I'm not questioning that we've tested how genes are passed on today
I know.
among
I'm not.
humans
But
that
I'm not. I'm
exist
not
right now.
assuming, dude. When I talk about this mutation suite thing, I'm not assuming common ancestry. I'm testing it. I'm taking a neutral
No.
position and looking.
See, this is how I know you're not listening, right? Because I wasn't accusing you
Okay.
of assuming common ancestry.
Okay.
That's
So
not what I was.
I'm sorry. What am I assuming? Like clearly.
Okay. The assumption is
Uh-huh.
that when the young Earth creationist posits that there are different natural kinds created,
Uh-huh.
that they don't share one common ancestor, that entails that we will see different genetic makeup than we happen to see today, right? You brought up like dogs or something, right?
Oh, I see. So you're saying I'm assuming the commitments on your view, but you told me I was assuming things on my view, I thought. But I guess you're saying I'm assuming things what we would be expected on your view. Is that correct?
You are assuming, right? You're assuming that in the young Earth creationist account, genetics have to make the same predictions that we would expect given a non-creational mechanism. But that's silly. Why would we expect a creational mechanism to act like a non-creational mechanism, right?
Well, let me
That's
tell you what
just
I'm assuming. I'm assuming that genetics works the same way, roughly speaking, does now as it did when God created Adam and Eve with
why.
their genomes.
Why?
So I asked you earlier, do you think that Adam and Eve reproduce differently and pass on genes differently? I don't. I think you said no to that, right? If you want to say, well, look, we have no reason to believe that genes work the same way back then as they do now,
What's
fine, you
the
could say that. That's
what
just that.
reason
But
do we have?
that's what ad hoc is, dude. You have
What
no reason
reason
to
do
think
we
it's
have
different.
to believe? What reason do we have to believe that the only relevant factor that we should consider is whether Adam and Eve reproduced the same way?
Well, this is just because it pertains to the inference I'm giving. But don't you realize that when you
And there
say,
are
look, we
other
have no
things that
reason to
pertain to
believe,
the inference you're making.
well, we can talk about the other inferences. I'm just talking about the shared
No.
mutations right now.
Bro,
Look,
you're
and
not understanding my question. My question was, how do you know that that's the only thing that pertains? How do you know there aren't 100 things that you can't check that pertain?
well, are you like what? Can you give an
Yeah,
example?
exactly. You wouldn't
If you're
know
just going to appeal to mystery, you're just appealing to ignorance, right? I don't take that to be like a quality of a good theory.
that. No,
Are you saying that there